Arthur looked like a man who had made it. He had the kind of life people quietly measured themselves against. A respected job, a stable home, a family that loved him, and a routine that looked disciplined from the outside. In meetings, he spoke with calm precision. At dinner, he smiled at the right moments. At family gatherings, he seemed grounded, capable, dependable. If someone had seen him only in public, they would have called him fortunate, maybe even successful. But there was another life happening behind his eyes. It started in the small moments. A compliment from a colleague would land in his mind and vanish almost immediately. "You handled that well," they would say, and Arthur would already be searching for the flaw. Maybe they were just being polite. Maybe the project was easier than it seemed. Maybe anyone in his position could have done it. Every victory was reduced, explained away, stripped of meaning before it had a chance to settle in. And every mistake, no matter how minor, became evidence. A missed detail in an email, a pause during a presentation, a sentence that didn't come out perfectly. Most people would move on. Arthur carried it home like a weight in his chest, replaying it over and over until it grew larger than the reality ever was. That was the trap. His mind never asked, "What did I do well?" It asked, "How close was I to being exposed?" This is how impostor syndrome works. It doesn't always arrive as panic. Sometimes it arrives as discipline, humility, even ambition. But underneath, it whispers the same message. You do not deserve what you have, and one day people will find out. For a man like Arthur, that message was brutal. Men are often taught to be competent, composed, and unshakable, to provide, to perform, to succeed without hesitation. So when doubt begins to speak, many men don't call it fear. They call it pressure. They call it standards. They call it responsibility. But inside, it feels like constantly standing on unstable ground. And the more Arthur achieved, the less relief he felt. Because success did not silence the voice. It only raised the stakes. If you've ever felt that your wins don't really count, that your best effort still isn't enough, or that people's respect is somehow based on a misunderstanding, stay with this story. You may think your problem is a lack of confidence. But the truth may be more dangerous than that. Because before a man can rebuild himself, he has to understand the invisible lie he has been living under. Arthur could walk into a room full of men and look like the one who had figured it all out. Clean shirt, steady voice, a good job, a family that loved him, and the kind of life people pointed at and called successful. But the strange thing about carrying shame is that it does not care how polished the outside looks. It follows you home. It sits beside you at the dinner table. It whispers in the quiet moments when no one is watching. At work, praise landed on him like something he had borrowed instead of earned. Great presentation. Strong leadership. You really handled that well. Arthur would smile, nod, and say the right thing, but inside he was already rewriting the story. They're just being nice. They didn't see the parts one messed up. If they knew what I was thinking, they'd change their minds. That was the cruel logic living in his head. Not facts, not evidence. A mood disguised as truth. And that is how negative confirmation bias begins to shape a man's identity. Every mistake becomes proof. Every hesitation becomes evidence. Every moment of uncertainty gets stored like a file marked, "See, you were right all along." Meanwhile, the victories are dismissed before they can even breathe. He finishes a hard task, and his mind says, anyone could have done that. He solves a problem, and his mind says, you just got lucky. He receives respect, and his mind says, they haven't seen the real you yet. At home, the pressure only grew quieter and heavier. His family could sense it even if they could not name it. His wife would look at him after a long day and ask, "Why do you always act like you're waiting to be found out?" Arthur would look away because the answer felt too embarrassing to say out loud. "Because I don't feel like I deserve any of this." And the worst part was that he meant it. This is where many men suffer in silence. Not because they lack strength, but because they have built their identity on impossible standards. They believe they must never struggle, never doubt, never need reassurance. So when their inner world does not match that image, they do not question the image. They question themselves. If you've ever felt that way, you're not alone. And if this hits close to home, Take a second and like the video, because this is bigger than one man's story. It's a pattern that can shape a life from the inside out. Arthur's breaking point did not arrive with noise. It came with a calendar reminder, a crucial presentation, a room full of executives, a chance to prove his value in front of people who already trusted him more than he trusted himself. The night before, he sat in the dark of his office, staring at his notes, feeling the old thought rise again like a familiar enemy. What if tomorrow they finally see I'm a fraud? Arthur stood in front of the conference room mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time, but his hands still trembled. In the glass, he saw the same man everyone else saw. Well-dressed, competent, calm on paper. Yet inside, his mind was already attacking him. You're going to freeze. They're going to hear it in your voice. They're going to realize you don't belong here. From the hallway, he could hear the low murmur of executives settling into their seats. The presentation he had prepared for weeks was only minutes away, but his chest felt tight, as if his body had already accepted defeat. He opened his laptop, scanned the first slide, and then stopped. Not because he had forgotten the material, because, for a second, he couldn't remember a single reason why he should trust himself. That was the cruelest part of impostor syndrome. It doesn't always tell you that you are incompetent. Sometimes it tells you that your competence is accidental, temporary, and undeserved. It turns every success into luck and every mistake into evidence. Arthur had led projects, solved problems, carried his team through pressure, and still his mind had a way of erasing all of it in one sentence. Anyone could have done that. He heard a familiar voice behind him. "You ready?" It was Daniel from the analytics department, holding a notebook and a coffee cup, looking completely unbothered by the moment. Arthur forced a half-smile. "Yeah, just getting into it." Daniel nodded. "You know this stuff better than anyone in the room." Arthur almost laughed. If only confidence were that simple. If only the facts could automatically override the feeling. But negative confirmation bias is ruthless. The mind doesn't search for truth when it's scared. It searches for threats. One awkward pause becomes proof of failure. One forgotten word becomes a verdict on identity. The meeting room doors opened. Arthur walked in, and every eye turned toward him. He felt the heat rise in his neck. His first few words came out carefully, almost too carefully, as if he were trying to avoid being caught pretending. Then something unexpected happened. The more he focused on the actual evidence in front of him, the data, the strategy, the results, the quieter the inner noise became. Not gone, just quieter. He clicked to the next slide and heard himself speak with more certainty. "This isn't theory. This is what we tested. This is what changed." And there it was, reality standing against the fear. He didn't become a different man in that room. He simply stopped treating his anxiety like a witness and started treating it like noise. Maybe that's the turning point for many men. Not when they suddenly feel worthy, but when they finally ask a better question. What if my feelings are not facts? If that question hits something in you, good, because the answer is closer than you think. And once Arthur sees it, he can no longer return to the old lie without paying attention to what comes next. Arthur stood alone in the empty conference room long after everyone else had gone home. The city lights pressed against the glass behind him, and on the table sat the slides he had spent weeks perfecting. His hands were still, but inside, everything was loud. The same voice that had followed him for years was there again, whispering that he was one wrong sentence away from being exposed. Not because he had failed, but because he had never truly been enough. Or so he had believed. He looked at the notes in front of him and, for the first time, did something different. He did not ask, "What if I mess this up?" He asked, "What is actually true?" And the answer was there, plain and undeniable. He had earned the promotion. He had led the project. He had solved problems no one else wanted to touch. Those were not accidents. Those were facts. The anxiety did not disappear, but it lost some of its power when faced with reality. That is the hidden battle so many men fight in silence. Not a lack of skill, not a lack of discipline, but a distorted habit of seeing themselves through the lens of their worst moments. One mistake becomes a verdict. One awkward silence becomes proof. One criticism becomes identity. And every success gets explained away so quickly that it never has a chance to become part of the story. That is how negative confirmation bias works. It trains a man to distrust his own evidence. When Arthur finally walked into the presentation room, he was still nervous. Confidence is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to stand anyway. He took a breath, looked at the people waiting for him, and began. First, his voice trembled. Then the room settled. His ideas were clear. His preparation showed. And as he moved from slide to slide, something inside him began to shift. Not because he had become perfect, but because he could no longer deny what was in front of him. Later, his wife found him in the kitchen, staring into a cup of cold coffee as if it might explain the universe. She smiled and said, "You know they were listening to you, right?" Arthur gave a tired laugh. "I kept waiting for them to realize I don't belong here." She shook her head. "Maybe you've just spent too long believing the harshest version of yourself. That is where change begins. Not with grand declarations, but with honesty. With learning to separate your worth from your performance. With building an identity on evidence instead of fear. With remembering that being uncertain does not make you fraudulent, and feeling inadequate does not mean you are incapable." If the story hit close to home, give it a like so more men can find it too. And be honest with yourself. What has your mind been calling proof that was really just fear? If you want more psychological truths like this, subscribe, because the next step is learning how to silence that inner judge without losing your edge.